Welcome to the We've Seen a Thing or Two podcast. As investigators and mediators focused on regulatory and workplace conflicts, we have seen a thing or two and learned a thing or two. In each episode, we will be speaking with industry leaders in regulation, human resources and law, as well as thought leaders and top performers in investigations and mediation. We bring our audience interesting and cutting-edge information on conflict management as it relates to professional regulation and workplace disputes. This industry is one of many views, and we have to say that some views shared by our guests are not necessarily shared by the We've Seen a Thing or Two podcast, its host, or sponsors. Today's show is brought to you by Benard Associates, trusted investigation and mediation professionals since 2004. Now here's your host, Dean Benard.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the show, and thank you for tuning in today. Before I introduce our guest today, I do want to apologize to our regular listeners for the long gap in episodes. Our last episode was in March, and we've been so busy taking care of client needs that we just simply didn't have time to get to this, and we had to sort of put the production of the podcast on hold. But we are back, and we're very excited to bring you this episode, and I want to thank you for joining us. Now, today I have with me Paul Nicholson. Now, Paul happens to be the Director of Workplace Solutions at Benard Associates. Yes, that's right. He's one of our own here at B&A, as we affectionately call it. Paul and I speak frequently and discuss the issues we see in workplace conflict and the challenges that we face as investigators and mediators. And we're working all the time to figure out ways to keep growing, improving, delivering on the work that we do. And we thought some of these discussions would make for an interesting episode of the podcast. And well, we're here. So first, let me tell you a little bit about Paul, and then we'll get going. So as I said, he is the Director of Workplace Solutions at Benard Associates. And in that role, he oversees the investigative work we do in the workplace setting. He also acts as a resource for other investigators and mediators that are on the team. And he's really the key point of contact for the majority of our clients, all while Paul carries his own caseload of investigations, mediations, and various human resources consulting projects. Now, Paul came to the B&A team with a great deal of experience as a human resources professional. He's certainly no stranger to managing and resolving workplace conflict. He's worked on some massive projects and assisted many of our clients through some very difficult challenges that they faced. The combination of his human resources background, investigation, and mediation skills, all of that makes him a real valuable commodity for us, but more importantly, for our clients. And for you sports fans out there, I like to say that, Paul's definitely a first-round draft pick, but I'm probably going on a little too much and embarrassing him now. But I should give you a little more background about him. He does hold a B&A from the University of Toronto, a graduate certificate in human resources management from Sheridan College, a certificate in alternative dispute resolution from the University of Toronto. He holds a QMed designation that is issued by the Alternative Dispute Resolution Institute of Ontario. And he also is a workplace fairness analyst, and he holds that designation from the Workplace Fairness Institute. So, all right, Paul, have I said enough?
Oh, you said enough. Thanks so much for the introduction, Dean. I appreciate it. I guess the only thing I'll add is the only time I've been a first-round draft pick is in the old-timer hockey league I play in. But thanks a lot for the introduction.
No problem. And so we'll make this one of our first-round draft pick podcasts by the time we're done here. So, Paul, we discussed this episode, and we talked a little bit about what we might focus on and discuss. And I think it really came pretty naturally to us as we had these discussions that we really should chat about the work that your team does and some of the trends that we've been seeing in the past year. And folks, I can tell you that Paul and his team have had some really interesting cases in the last year, and we talk about them all the time. We thought the easiest thing to do and the most interesting thing to do would be to share some of the conversations that Paul and I have with all of you. So when you're on the pointy end of the stick of the work that we do, there's no shortage of interesting and controversial topics that you could discuss based on that firsthand exposure. So, Paul, let's get into it.
Like you said, you called the show, we've certainly seen a thing or two, and I think that's fair to say in the Workplace Solutions division. But I don't want to make this an infomercial, but I guess I should give a quick rundown of what our team does in Workplace Solutions. So there's really three areas that I describe to our clients or parties sometimes that we're interviewing. And I'll say that we conduct workplace investigations, harassment investigations, discrimination investigations, abuse investigations, as well as we're seeing a little bit more board executive conflict as well, particularly in the nonprofit sector. The second area is mediation, where we are conflict resolution coaches, really, to bring parties together to resolve or manage their conflict moving forward. And the third piece of work we do are really interesting projects we call workplace assessments. This is an opportunity to interview members of a team where there might be sort of dark clouds overhead on a team. There's no complaint necessarily, but we're looking at what might be causing the conflict. Are there roots in terms of change management? Has a new computer system come in that are driving people nuts and they're not interacting the same way that they used to? Is there something in the workplace culture or in interpersonal conflicts on the team? Is there something to do with psychological safety that we can look at to improve things for that team before it gets to the point of requiring a harassment or discrimination or abuse investigation? So those are some of the things that we focus on in the division.
Oh, that's great, Paul. I always joke about my 150 floor elevator speech because between the work of your team and the work of the regulatory side of our organization, I need way too much time to explain everything we do. So give it all the work you do. That was a pretty succinct explanation. I'm working on getting a little better at that. So you and I have been talking about some trends in cases that seem to be coming back again and again lately, and not just COVID related stuff. I mean, I know there's a lot of talk around COVID, and we're going to kind of avoid the whole COVID discussion today and talk more about other things. But what are some of the things that you see out there right now?
Yeah, you and I talk regularly, almost every day, about the cases that are coming through. We certainly see regular cases where there's a single complainant complaining about, let's say, a supervisor or a member of the management team, or a worker making a harassment complaint against another coworker. But every day, it seems like we're seeing something that's a little bit more unique in terms of the relationship between the parties, the authority levels of the parties. And I guess one bit of headline news in my books is the apparent erosion of management authority. We're used to seeing complaints coming in from employees toward their managers. And it makes sense, of course. There's formal authority there. There's positional power. What's more unusual are two types of cases that seem to indicate that many organizations have flipped the script a bit on traditional positional power. The first type are these cases with managers submitting harassment complaints against people who report to them. So let's say, Dean, I start spreading gossip about you, or you ask me to change the way we do billing, and I just keep on billing the way I've always done for years. Or what if you tell me I need to change the way I format my investigation reports, but I tell you I'll only take your instructions if I hear it from someone else, like someone who's really in authority or someone I really respect.
Oh, okay. Let me think about that one. The collaborative side of me would no doubt kick in, and we'd have a nice conversation about that, Paul, and we'd figure it all out. But seriously, I think that would be an issue for any reporting relationship. If we saw that kind of thing happening, it's going to create a rift for sure.
Right. We're seeing more of these cases, though, that reach the level of an actual complaint. So at first glance, they fit all the criteria for a finding of harassment. The issue is that the manager had the authority built right into their job title to do something about it, and to have done something about it long before the complaint in many cases, just by virtue of being a manager, to discipline, to terminate. But the choice some managers are making is to submit a workplace harassment complaint through senior management or through the HR department. What does that bring to mind for you?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, that's a huge issue. I mean, obviously they have a right to complain, but I've got to wonder, is that a cop-out, to avoid having that tough conversation or to push someone else into making the hard decisions? And, I guess it could also be a lack of confidence or a lack of understanding by the manager as to what their options are.
Yeah, I think this is an issue where managers don't actually seem to think they have the authority. They've tried to address an issue repeatedly. They've been coached maybe to death by HR, or they've lost grievances. And, I sometimes say, I had a manager once that said to me, it's hard to be good at stuff regarding people management. And, managers can be very technically proficient often, but when it comes to the people leadership side and having these kinds of conversations where their sense of authority has been eroded, they can sometimes get to a point that they feel they've been shut down, they've had their authority curtailed by maybe a past mistake, and they feel they can't address tough behavior.
So have you made findings in these situations where some complaints against subordinates in the last little while?
Yeah, I've seen several. And, one comes to mind particularly that's somewhat new. I had one where I asked if the supervisor addressed the behavior they were seeing from their subordinate. And they actually said to me, it hadn't even occurred to them And they didn't feel comfortable dealing with conflict. They thought that was a management responsibility, not a supervisor responsibility. So they really didn't even think of this core area of leadership as being something that even belonged to them.
Interesting. Okay, so what's the bottom line to you then? Can a subordinate engage in workplace harassment against a superior?
Well, here's my take, and a labor lawyer may have, some great expertise to add to this conversation, but I think that all employees are entitled to a harassment-free workplace. So let's start it there. Nobody needs to accept a toxic work environment where they're subjected to an unwelcome course of vexatious behavior toward them, being humiliated or being delegitimized. And that's really irrespective of your job title or authority. So it's certainly possible any employee could engage in that type of behavior toward any other employee. But the difficulty I have is that every appropriately supported supervisor or manager has the ability to manage, to coach, to discipline before it becomes a repeated course of behavior. So I see this type of complaint as a way of sort of delegating the responsibility for dealing with behavior to others, to senior leadership, to HR, or to an external investigator. So sure, we can make a harassment finding, but if the supervisor didn't really exercise their authority before the investigation, it makes me wonder, are they going to start doing so after the investigation? Even if we have supported the organization, we've made a finding, we've armed them with something external, hopefully a good, robust investigation report. Are they going to get the legitimacy and the leadership skills that they needed to act on that after the investigation? In fact, I could actually see the social standing of the manager diminished in some cases because they've chosen to make that complaint. So I'm not saying any of this to beat up on supervisors. In fact, I think it's the toughest time in history to lead people in a way. But at some point, organizations need to realize the legal framework they operate under. And that really is a legally enshrined autocracy, as a trainer once told me. The managers make the rules and employees have to follow them within certain boundaries, like discrimination and workplace safety. You have to do it because I say so may not be the kind of leadership I would want. I know it's not the kind of leadership you provide or you would endorse, but at the end of the day, it's ultimately that's the legally enshrined authority that managers technically at least do have.
Right. And there's a lot of leadership styles out there. I, for one, practice this concept of servant leadership. And I like a very collaborative approach, but I know there are leaders that have a much more sort of, rule, do what I say, not as I do. And I don't really agree with that. I think that can also be at the root of some issues. And to your point earlier that you made about how, some managers who choose to go down this route of making a complaint about a subordinate, they might be ostracized or looked down upon in some ways, perhaps by their peers or their leaders. I've seen that. I've seen cases where that's happened. And you really have to wonder, and I know neither one of us is trying to slam managers here, but no. I really have to wonder, not everyone's cut out to be a manager. And sometimes there are certain things managers have to be able to do, and they have to be able to do it in the right way that will make them successful. And so, I've got this line that I always say, it's not the what, but the how. I, as a manager, have all kinds of authority to tell you that you need to do X, Y, or Z. How I convey that authority, how I deal with you, that hierarchy exists, but it's how we go about it, right? The application of authority has to be accompanied by dignity, respect for the people you deal with. And that's where things kind of go off the rails sometimes. Now, you mentioned a second type of case you're seeing related to that idea of managerial authority. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, I'll riff a little bit on that idea, Dean. I think it's the same issue from a different angle. Cases where the employee is absolutely certain that the manager is a tyrant, but the evidence they provide to us to support the allegation is the manager asked them to do things that they disagree with. Now, there's often a lot of descriptive language with that, but at the end of the day, they're really saying, you asked me to do something and I didn't appreciate being asked to do it.
Right. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. So I guess without trying not to give away any of our specific cases, it could be issues like asking to be included in all meetings on a topic or asking to be included in emails. There are situations where the complainant states the manager's forcing an employee to do something they're uncomfortable with because they put a task in their schedule. So in a way, it's not the action, but it's how the action's interpreted. So a manager asks you to perform a task, but it's being received as you forced me to do the task. It's the description that sort of does the damage, not the actual delegation of a task. So I can say they all have the common thread of extreme language to describe the manager's impact. They make me feel this big, they'll say, or they forced me, or I had to do X against my will. And then it'll be the impact statements. I haven't slept in weeks. I'm afraid to go to work and check my emails, or I'm thinking about going on a medical leave of absence, or I just can't take it anymore. And these impacts are important. I don't want to, have any of our listeners think that we're lacking empathy in hearing these. These are often real impacts that our complainants are experiencing. But when we match it up with the actual transaction that's occurred, I'll say, in terms of the complaint, really it is that a manager has used their authority and they've asked an employee to do something. So when you ask probing questions about what actually happened, these cases come down to a sincere belief that asking an employee to do other than what they would have done in the absence of having a manager is really absolute tyrannical harassment to that employee. But I will say the complainant is typically 100% sincere. Have you seen that phenomenon, Dean?
Yeah, I have actually. And you're right. I mean, the complainants often truly believe they're being harassed. And sometimes they sort of have this approach with the manager that, it's related to poor communication. Sometimes they feel that they're off base and they stack their own evidence. The problem is that often that evidence is based more on how they feel than the facts, or it's based on rumor, or it's based on some other issue that maybe happened in the past. And so they have, as you say, this sincere belief that there's an issue, but they don't have an objective sort of lens that they're looking through. And when we look through that objective lens, sometimes that evidence, that hard evidence, just isn't there.
Right. So I sort of see this in a way as the flip side of the manager complaint against the subordinate I mentioned earlier. You get a subordinate employee who is sincerely, completely taken aback that the manager is using the legally enshrined authority that they have. In fact, it's often apparent that complainant is being completely insubordinate to the supervisor or manager, that they're 100% sincere in their misunderstanding of the supervisor's legitimate authority. So what do you think we should do about this as investigators?
Well, I mean, I think it's rarely a one-way street that we're dealing with, first off. I mean, I always try to be very open-minded around that. And the solution really needs to be based on identifying the underlying issues. I mean, is it poor communication, maybe on both sides of the equation? Is there a culture issue within the organization that impacts the communication, or preconceived ideas that people might have? I think we really need to look at some of those things.
Absolutely. And I think culture is central to this as well. And I'm getting more and more influenced by this idea that it's the culture of many workplaces that's shifted so much that legal autocracy of the employer-employee relationship is totally eroded. And in some organizations, managers who rely on that type of authority aren't really supported in using it to require employees to comply. Again, this is that autocracy. It can be done with dignity and respect, but at the end of the day, using that legally enshrined authority. So even above that, many supervisors don't accept this type of authority themselves, and they just would never employ it. I think we've all seen this shift to an extent. Giving an instruction or a task tends to be done with much more care, communication, and consideration in the past. In fact, I was just talking to someone socially. This is outside of the workplace, but I was speaking to them on the weekend, and they're a sports coach. And they had a situation of taking a child from one position on a sports team to another because someone was away for that game. And it led to so much conflict. The demand from the family was that there needed to have been a pre-discussion with the parents, then a formal meeting with the child, and then preparation before the game, then the game. And simply having that conversation briefly before the game led to allegations of trauma, dehumanizing treatment, all kinds of quite significant concerns. So we have two stories of workplace harassment here. The liberation of many organizations from formal legal autocracy, leading to fewer traditional cases of tyrannical bosses, but of course, will always be out there. And the other story is the rise of harassment cases I mentioned that I see as related to the absence of a replacement for that form of authority. That's where we see supervisors seeking other remedies, like a formal complaint, to force an employee to change the way they're behaving because they can't rely on traditional authority to do it anymore in their particular circumstances. And let's remember, the job of a manager in some ways is to get employees to behave in ways other than they would if they didn't exist as a supervisor.
Interesting. And we've talked a lot about organizational issues, power, authority, kind of on a theoretical level to some degree. But we are workplace investigators, and we do want to stay in our lane. So what does all this mean when the investigation is over? We've either substantiated the allegations or we haven't, but there's this climate of a lack of authority, a lack of legitimate authority. What's next? Where do we go from here?
Yeah. Well, let me start here. The work we do is very important, but I always say that the work the organization does after our involvement ends is even more important. But let's look at the legal minimum an organization needs to do after an investigation. So we're based here in Ontario. Looking at the legislation in Ontario, the Occupational Health and Safety Act requires workplaces to have a harassment program that sets out how a complainant and respondent will be informed of the results of the investigation and any corrective action that's been taken or will be taken. And that information has to be in writing. So let's just play this out in the real world, though. Say you've made a complaint, Dean. You claim that your coworker discriminated against you. In your case, let's say it's on the basis of age. just kidding.
You see what I have to put up with here, folks? All right, go ahead, Paul.
Okay, so there's been some behavior that discriminates against you. You've been put down, diminished for, let's say, a year, and you finally complained. The respondent's somebody you meet on Zoom once a week. Maybe you work on a mobile truck with them multiple times a week. Regardless, you see this coworker fairly frequently and you need to work with them. Their behavior has really crushed your spirit. You're losing sleep. You're anxious to go to work. There's real harm you've experienced. So the employer investigates. A neutral investigator meets with you. You go through a stressful interview. Then you wait, let's say 3 weeks or so to find out what happened. And all that time, you've been told not to discuss any aspect of the investigation. We're protecting the integrity of the investigation from our side. After being in anxious limbo for a few weeks, you come into work on a Monday morning, and there's an email from your HR manager. And attached, there's a written letter. And I'm going to read a theoretical letter to you, Dean. So here's the letter. Dear Dean, this letter summarizes the results of our investigation into your allegations that you experienced workplace discrimination and harassment. As we discussed, the company takes such allegations very seriously and will not tolerate inappropriate behavior in the workplace. After a thorough investigation, the independent investigator concluded that one or more of your allegations was substantiated. Although privacy considerations limit our ability to share confidential information with you about other employees, I can tell you that the appropriate action has been taken to ensure that such conduct does not repeat itself. And, there's a few other details in the letter, but you sort of skim over the rest. Your allegations are substantiated, right? So you win, quote unquote. So how do you feel? You've gotten this letter. You're the winner.
Well, I don't think I'm feeling very good at all. It's pretty anticlimactic. I've got no idea what to expect next. I'm likely fearful of some level of reprisal that could come from any direction. And there's really no sense of closure for me. So yeah, I'm not feeling that great about that letter.
But hold on. We're your employer, and we told you we'll take appropriate corrective action. We can't tell you that the respondent was given a 3-day suspension. That's private in terms of the discipline. But we've spent all this money on an external investigation. We've disciplined the respondent. What more do you want? We've met our legal obligations. You're starting to sound like a troublemaker, to be honest.
Well, let's just say that the next words from my mouth in that scenario could probably get me in trouble.
Right. So the management perspective can sometimes be to say, we're done here, move on. But my experience in speaking to employees who've made previous formal complaints that we're investigating is that they won't forget what happened in the investigation for the rest of their careers. We often hear these stories of what was successfully or unsuccessfully investigated in the past. So even if you think the employees should move on and you make a judgment call that an investigation was minor, it wasn't minor to them. And we could list all sorts of negative consequences if the post-investigation communication doesn't go well. The main two that come to mind for me are the loss of what I call discretionary effort and the multiplying compounding effect of what I call myth creation. So when I say discretionary effort, I'm talking about the effort you make at work above what you need to publicly contribute to keep your job. That's gone. And myth creation is all the stories we tell about our work to other people, coworkers, especially new ones, family, friends, the Twitterverse. One common myth that a disaffected complainant might create and continue building year after year is don't make a complaint around here or you'll regret it. Have you seen some of that play out in your cases, Dean?
Yes. I've actually had cases where past situations have occurred prior to any involvement I've had, and there's an immediate lack of faith in the process, right? So you're talking to somebody and they're already, before you even get started, they're criticizing the process. They're demonstrating their lack of trust. They're concerned about confidentiality because they've experienced breaches of confidentiality in the past, or they've heard about it. And I put heard about it in quotes because a lot of times that's what happens. But in the end, yeah, there's a bit of an uphill battle sometimes that gets created for future investigations based on outcomes and how past situations were managed. However, people continue to make the complaints because in most cases, they think it's their only option.
Right. So I think you've got some pretty significant risks as an organization linked to the investigation itself, but we can also add up the compounding effects of low discretionary effort and toxic myth creation. And those risks can be just as serious and linger on for years. Really, sometimes we're thinking about risk only in terms of the risk of litigation or what might come out of the complaint that originated our involvement. So let's go back to a workplace investigation where there's a sincere belief that the manager's a bully, but it's more of an issue at the organization of legitimate authority. The investigator writes up a report and the allegation isn't substantiated. And you've gotten that form of letter we talked about earlier. But this time it says the investigation did not obtain information to substantiate your allegation. So that's it. You're back to work with your manager the next day. So do you accept the letter? Probably not. In fact, I'd say there are hardly any complainants who've ever accepted that kind of a debrief letter, even if it's given to them in a meeting verbally, eyeball to eyeball. They don't accept your findings, but they have to go back to work. And a lot of effort has been made on the investigation.
Right. So what can organizations do about this issue? I mean, they've met their obligations, but there's a real likelihood of ongoing risk and harm, clearly. The manager may be fearful of the employee who placed the complaint, or they may think that they can no longer manage their performance. The employee likely still thinks their manager's a bully. They're probably still telling other coworkers that that's the case. I mean, where does it go from here? What do we do?
Yeah, so I think we need to improve the debrief and be honest and clear. If the complainant's allegations are not substantiated, it's not just that the investigator couldn't find enough evidence. We heard what you alleged, and it just ain't harassment.
So now we move on to some kind of restoration of the relationship to what it ought to be: mediation, facilitation, coaching, education. I guess we have to pick.
Well, you brought up mediation. So I guess let's think about what mediation really is. I think of it as an assisted negotiation between the parties. In this kind of complaint, it may be necessary to require the parties to attend. And since mediation is always voluntary, organizations could consider it a facilitated management meeting and not mediation in a technical sense. Often we hear that one party, usually the complainant, isn't comfortable meeting with the manager. And this is a tough message, I'm going to say, but I think I have to say it here. It's too bad in that situation because we can't let this linger without any further communication than what we've talked about so far in that letter. The manager certainly isn't comfortable having an employee they can't manage and who's telling the workplace what a terrible person they are. So that can't be the status quo. The complainant simply needs to be clearly corrected and educated about the amount of authority that the organization's giving to the manager. So say it clearly. They're able to assign you tasks. The supervisor is able to schedule your procedures. They're permitted to prioritize your work. They can ask you to stop spending your time on certain tasks you think are important and ask you to spend that effort elsewhere. They can require you to include them on communication that's important to the department. The organization approves of all these things, and the complainant needs to know it. So now we're not endorsing a form of leadership here that hovers and micromanages every employee, but I do think that there's an appropriate message to send that these are all tools in the manager's toolbox, and none of them are harassment. The manager isn't just there to approve vacation requests and solve problems with other departments that the employee has. If the employee and team are achieving their goals, managers might not exercise any of these delegated authorities I was talking about. Keep rocking it, employees, that's great. But we're talking here about times when tasks, priorities, efforts, performance, something in there is a matter of concern. And these authorities that the supervisor has are real. They're entrenched in that autocratic structure at the foundation of the employment relationship.
Okay, so we've talked about these sort of two post-investigation tasks, the debrief and the facilitated discussion, or what we might call that quasi-mediation. What else can the employer be looking to do?
Well, I think the third pillar of an effective post-investigation plan is just operational problem solving, that pragmatic problem solving. Sometimes we're tempted to look at harassment investigations only at the individual level of, let's say, two people, complainant, respondent. A term I really don't like, personality conflict, can be used sometimes as a catch-all to simply blame the individuals in conflict. Operational problem solving gets at the heart of the conflict, looking at what processes lead to poor communication, power imbalances, maybe it's overwork. Operational problem solving in my books is conflict resolution. So organizations need to ask themselves the question, if both the individuals in conflict were replaced, is it likely that other people in those same roles would also eventually come into conflict? Personality is always an element of conflict, but if two employees who stand up for themselves would get into the same situation, the same form of conflict, when you add time and pressure, that means there's operational problem solving to do, not just interpersonal conflict resolution. So I encourage organizations not to stop at that individual level of analysis. There's often problem solving to do regarding organizational design, communication, business processes, even the way vacation approvals are done in some of the investigations I've done.
Oh, vacation approvals. By the way, yours is canceled for that age crack you made earlier.
Oh, thanks.
Seriously, though, well, this has really been an interesting conversation, Paul. I mean, it's very clear that the workplace landscape is under constant evolution, and the challenges of conflict are front and center as we see it every day. And the solutions don't always rest in simply investigating individual issues, but instead, sometimes you need to explore those bigger issues that look at that bigger picture. Frankly, a picture that you and I could probably talk about for hours on end. So I think with that, I'm going to sort of bring this to a bit of a close. And I really want to thank you for joining me today and sharing your insights. It's really been great.
Well, thanks a lot for having me on the show, Dean. It's been great to talk about workplace solutions. And I guess what we've been talking about mostly is kind of that add-on piece to workplace investigations. And, you know, when clients want us to kind of stay within our lane as workplace investigators, we draft a report, we substantiate or we don't substantiate the allegations. That's absolutely fine. But we also really care about getting to the root causes of workplace conflict wherever we can. So if we can partner with organizations to support that root cause resolution, we're happy to be part of that conversation.
100%. I agree with you. I mean, I think there's so much more that we can offer. And although, as you say, we want to stay in our lane, at the same time, I think at the very least, we can have conversations that can help guide our clients in the right direction in terms of where they go from there, and then see where that goes. Now, I do have a little tradition on this show of asking guests what things are near and dear to their hearts when they're not engaged in their day-to-day work. And so why don't you tell our audience what that looks like for you?
Well, thanks, Dean. I guess you mentioned earlier that I was a draft pick or something, and I guess I should mention I love to play old-timer hockey. My sister actually got me back into hockey after being away from the game for many years. It's been great to be involved in co-ed and old-timer hockey year-round, and kind of leading that as well, getting my kids out to the rink. And, you know, this time of year, we've got an election coming up June 2nd in our province, and I love to follow what's going on in provincial politics and see where our public policy is headed.
I envy you around the hockey because as some people know, I've relocated my residence and I'm living in Nova Scotia now. And I used to play hockey quite a bit. And of course, with the COVID pandemic, I know we said we weren't going to talk about COVID, but hockey kind of came to a grinding halt for the last couple of years in many respects. And then now I'm living out in Nova Scotia. And so for any of my Nova Scotia listeners, if you know a group of people that are looking for another very mediocre player to join them to play hockey, reach out to me. I'd really appreciate it. So with that, speaking of reaching out, Paul, how could people reach out to you?
Oh, I think the easiest way to get all of our contact info, just to mention quickly, is probably our website, www.benardinc.com. And all my contact info is listed there. All of our team members and their bios are available to learn a little bit about our various backgrounds and to get in touch.
Great. Well, again, Paul, thank you so much. Well, everybody, I guess that is a wrap for this episode. Thanks again for listening. And please send us your feedback on how we're doing. I say this at the end of every show. Our goal here, as with everything we do, all the stuff Paul and I have talked about, is constant and never-ending improvement. And we really do need your feedback to do that. If you want to check out previous podcast episodes, you can find it in all the podcast directories. It's also linked to our website at benardinc.com. And if you want to reach out to me, you can email me at dbenard@benardinc.com or look for Dean Benard on LinkedIn. So with that, take care, everyone. We'll see you next time on the We've Seen a Thing or Two podcast. Bye-bye.